And welcome to our Community Wide Kristallnacht commemoration. My name is Belle Jarneski, and I am the Executive Director of the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada. Tonight, we will present an excellent film about the exploration of the lost Holocaust history of Vilna through the use of ground-penetrating radar. After the film, we're pleased to present geophysicist Paul Bauman of Calgary, who is a member of that expedition and will speak about investigative work that he did at the death camp of Sobibor. Before we begin, a reminder that this program is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. And please direct any questions that you may have via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Jason Gesser, the chair of the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg's Public Affairs and Advocacy Committee.
Thank you, Belle. Good evening. My name is Jason Gesser, and I'm the chair of the Public Affairs and Advocacy Committee of the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg. It is my honor to bring greetings for tonight's Community Wide Kristallnacht Event on behalf of Federation. Tonight, we, along with Jewish people around the world, have come together to commemorate Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, reflecting on the devastation that anti-Semitism and hatred can bring if left unchecked. The Federation is pleased to present tonight's Kristallnacht event and Holocaust Education Week in partnership with the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada and other community organizations, supporting high-quality programming that perpetuates awareness of the Holocaust through education and remembrance. I would like to recognize that we are gathered on Treaty 1 territory, the homeland of the Métis, and the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Inuit peoples. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. May we live with respect on this land and in peace and friendship with its peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Tonight marks our final event for Holocaust Education Week, coinciding with Kristallnacht. The Jewish Heritage Center thanks the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg for its partnership and ongoing support, as well as the Azrieli Foundation, the Jewish Foundation of Manitoba, and the Asper Foundation, all of whom help us ensure that Holocaust education reaches thousands of students and adults each year with our programming. In our turbulent 2021 world, it is more important than ever to commemorate Kristallnacht. For the Nazis, Kristallnacht tested the response of civil society to the violent persecution of the Jews. From November 9th through 10th, 1938, more than 1,000 synagogues were burnt to the ground throughout Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. Jewish-owned homes and businesses were destroyed, hundreds of Jews were killed, and some 30,000 Jewish males were arrested. Most were transferred to camps such as Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. Today, anti-Semitic rhetoric and systemic racism continue to infect civil society. The pandemic and online hate have exacerbated virulent anti-Semitic views, Holocaust distortion, and conspiracy theories. The annual commemoration of Kristallnacht is a reminder that the fraying of civil society must be taken seriously and actively opposed. In the words of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Kristallnacht was not just the night of broken glass, it was the night of broken lives and broken societies. Before the death camps and gas chambers, in the heart of Lithuania, the Nazis shot as many as 100,000 people, mostly Jews, in systematic executions, and then hid the evidence of the mass murder in what is now a peaceful forest called Ponar, was once ground zero for Hitler's final solution. Once known as the Jerusalem of the North, Vilna was a thriving epicenter of Jewish culture and learning before the Nazis invaded more than 70 years ago. 10 days after the invasion, in June of 1941, the Nazis brought the first groups of Jews to the Ponar forest, where they lined them up and shot them. Eventually, with the help of a Lithuanian riflery unit, 70,000 Jews, along with 30,000 other suspected so-called undesirables, were murdered. In 2016, an international team of archaeologists took part in an expedition to locate the last traces of the Jews of Vilna. Using ground-penetrating radar, extraordinary discoveries were made, which immediately generated news headlines around the world, and the find was designated a top science story of 2016. The film, which you are about to see, tells the remarkable story. Following the film, Paul Bauman, a geophysicist who was a member of that 2016 team, will talk about his work and answer any questions you may have. Please remember to submit them via the Q&A button. Greg, please screen the film.
In the heart of Lithuania, archaeologists search for a tunnel, rumored to have been dug by desperate Jewish prisoners inside a little-known Nazi execution site called Ponar.
They were systematically exterminating people at this site.
Once you get taken away, you go to Ponar to die. Nobody comes out of Ponar alive.
Let's look at the IP, see what we get.
The investigation will open a nearly forgotten chapter of the Holocaust. The story of Vilna, a renowned center of Jewish culture, destroyed by the Nazis. Now, a team of scientists from around the world has come here,
Could be a trench, could be a pit.
searching for the last traces of a vanished people.
Where's the grave here?
Who were they?
Vilna was one of the most important cities in Jewish history.
It had the greatest scholars. It had the greatest writers.
Armed with advanced scientific tools, their work will help restore the memory of this lost world. And something more.
We're picking up 2 hotspots.
A story of hope in the city's final hours. But time is running out. Few remain who remember. Is there anything left to be found?
There is something there.
The secret history of Vilna and the legendary Holocaust escape tunnel.
Take the moment. Take the moment.
Right now on Nova.
Major funding for Nova is provided by the following.
Learn more at cancercenter.com.
Do people tell you that you've got your mom's eyes or your dad's toes? 23andMe.com is a genetic service that provides personalized reports about traits, health, and ancestry, and can help you understand why you are who you are. Learn more at 23andMe.com.
The David H. Koch Fund for Science, supporting Nova and promoting public understanding of science. And the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by PBS viewers like you. Thank you. Additional funding from Margie and Robert Cartman. And the Steve Perry Foundation.
Just 6 miles outside of Lithuania's capital city is a forest park few have ever heard of. Here, more than 70,000 people, most of them Jews, were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. There are no gravestones. The bodies could be anywhere. But that's not the only secret buried here. More than 75 years ago, 80 Jewish prisoners attempted to dig a tunnel and escape. Only the entrance was ever found, leaving questions unanswered. Was it ever finished? Where did it lead? The answers seem lost to time, but can science reopen the investigation and help us understand not only this place, but the Holocaust itself?
It's strange to say, but the Holocaust is actually much more terrible than we realize, and it happened in a way different than we think.
For some, it is a history still unresolved.
Shalom.
These people are the children of a unique group of Holocaust survivors. Their fathers survived the killing pits of Ponar forest.
My father used to say that they started it just behind.
Not that I ever doubted that the stories were the right stories, obviously.
They heard stories of the tunnel. But with their fathers now gone, and no firm evidence, only questions remain. What really happened?
It would complete the entire picture if they would find the tunnel.
Now, two archaeologists, Richard Freund of the University of Hartford and John Seligman of the Israeli Antiquities Authority, believe they can answer these questions. But doing so will take them to a place few would expect: Lithuania. Armed with new technology,
We now know we're going to follow that line back.
their mission is focused on a renowned city of 70,000 Jews wiped out by the Nazis. The traces are almost invisible today. And with each passing decade, the story is further distorted by the lens of time.
We're picking up 2 hotspots.
To unlock the hidden history of this lost city will require not one investigation, but 3. The search begins where Vilna ended, the brutal Nazi execution site known as Ponar. To this day, the location of multiple mass graves is still a mystery. The second piece of the puzzle is Vilna's great synagogue, devastated by the Nazis, erased by the Soviets after the war, as if to warn the Jews, don't come back. The last piece takes them back to the forest and Vilna's final chapter, to find proof that the escape tunnel really existed. If successful, the team may uncover not just a lost civilization, but a turning point in the evolution of the Nazi killing machine. Today, few clues would reveal it, but more than 75 years ago, it was here in Lithuania that the final solution, the systematic mass murder of 6 million Jews, first began. Before the industrialized killing of the gas chambers in places like Auschwitz, the Nazis and their collaborators murdered Jews here by the thousands, one bullet at a time.
They began killing 500, 600, 700 people per day. This is ground zero for the final solution.
It is a painful history Lithuania is only now beginning to explore. The pieces were in motion by 1940. Lithuania was trapped under a brutal occupation by Stalin's Soviet army. With the Germans approaching the border, anti-Semitism, already simmering, exploded.
Right before the war, Nazi propaganda flooded the country of Lithuania, promoting the idea that Jews were communists and communists were Jews, and that if the Soviet Union was moving tanks into the country, it was because of the Jews. Now, in fact, most Jews were not communists, and most communists were not Jews. But that idea really took hold in the Lithuanian consciousness, and it was very, very damaging.
Amidst the upheaval, the Soviet army began digging pits to store oil and gas just outside the capital, in Ponar forest. Samuel Bach, now an internationally known artist, spent part of his childhood in the nearby village.
I was there. I was in Ponar, in this dacha of my aunt. I remember this kind of the noise of the digging, of their construction, that was supposed to be a big base for containers of gas.
But construction was never finished. In June 1941, the Germans invaded Lithuania and pushed the Soviets out.
In June, the Germans attacked us. They bombed us. And on the 24th, they walked into our city.
The Nazis soon found Lithuanian collaborators eager to help in the killing of Jews. They also found something else: the freshly dug pits in the forest. Just days after the invasion, they brought the first victims to the site, where they were shot.
And this Holocaust by bullets, as it's called, that's how it starts. It's how half of the victims die. But it's also the decisive moment when it's realized that something like this is possible.
This was the tipping point, because at this place, they began systematically killing the Jews.
When historians try to understand when did the Germans decide that the policy of the war would be total annihilation, total extermination of the Jews, they look at the summer of 1941 and they see a real turning point in this transition to mass murder.
The killing was directed by Nazi troops known as Einsatzgruppen.
We know the people's names. Martin Weiss was the head of that unit, and he was the person who directly responsible for the management of Ponar. Under his control, he had now 150 Lithuanian volunteers from the Lithuanian Rifle Association who went into another unit which was called the Special Ones. They were the ones who were directly responsible for the actual killing and the actual annihilation of the Jewish population on a day-to-day basis.
Поступили следующим образом, отправили в Понары, поскольку Понары — это лагерь смерти.
Going to Ponar was death. That's what people said. There was no escaping.
Решили, пусть поработает.
Today, trains still pass by Ponar Forest.
You're hearing the trains going by. There were three ways that they used to bring the victims here. One was by truck, one was by walking, and one was by train. So when you hear these trains, you're listening to the sounds of the first moments of the final solution.
Little evidence survives. The Jewish State Museum here is determined to preserve what still remains. 6 burial pits have been identified so far. There may be more.
There are as many as 12 burial pits here.
But how to find them? German aerial photographs from the war provide one clue. More recently, a LiDAR study commissioned by the Jewish State Museum used laser imagery to strip away the foliage, confirming the 6 known pits. A large indentation in the ground nearby reveals a possible 7th pit. But they can't simply start digging.
The biggest problem that you face is that there are people buried here. How do you excavate to find out which way?
Geophysicists Paul Bauman and Alistair McClymont
Interesting to see how deep that is.
Very deep.
are using a tool that is relatively new to the field of archaeology: electrical resistivity tomography. The technology requires no digging at all. Instead, the team will essentially scan the ground in a narrow slice, generating a picture of the soil hidden below.
We have these gadgets, these things that can see under the ground. Our goal is to identify the area of the pit, the depth of the pit, and then we can calculate a volume in the pit.
Once the volume is known, the team can then estimate the number of bodies buried within. The first step is to hammer a line of metal spikes into the ground. The spikes are then linked together with cables. A control unit, powered by a car battery, then fires hundreds of electrical pulses and measures the way the soil conducts electricity. The resulting measurements are then assembled into a detailed map, revealing what lies below. To the trained eyes of the geophysicists, it can reveal where the natural soil ends and any disturbance, like a mass grave, begins.
It is a subtle signature. However, we're fortunate that in this environment, it's this homogeneous sand where everything looks the same. So even a subtle signature stands out very clearly.
The entire process takes hours as the machine sends electricity into the ground, slowly mapping the soil.
Something's happening at...
It takes multiple passes.
How many meters do you think it could be off? 5 to 10? 10 to 20?
Before they finally start to see results.
Oh, this is better. So that's good. Looks like we have a pit.
The rest of the team is summoned, and Freund briefs the student volunteers.
It's about 24 meters large, 4 meters deep. So it's a burial pit. If somebody asks you what is going on here, you could say that there are about 5,000 to 7,000 people who are buried in this unknown pit.
Thousands of people buried in this forest, murdered by the Nazis. But who were they? Today, this city goes by its Lithuanian name, Vilnius. But for centuries, it also had another name, one rarely heard now, Vilna. Its name in both Hebrew and Yiddish, the everyday language of European Jews. They called it the Jerusalem of the North.
That's an unusual title. There are only a few communities in Jewish history that got named the Jerusalem of.
Vilna was one of the most important cities in Jewish history, certainly one of the capitals of European Jewish civilization.
Prior to World War II, Jews made up a large part of the city.
Most people think New York is a very, very Jewish city. Well, that's 15%. But Vilna was, at its peak, 40% Jewish.
It was a center of Jewish learning, of Jewish culture, of Jewish politics.
6 Jewish newspapers, museums, the largest Jewish library in the world. Essia Friedman was born in Vilna before the war.
For me, Vilna was the most beautiful place in the world. Everything was gorgeous. Any little synagogue that you went in was beautiful.
There was all this learning, and there was a very specific cultural character of the Jews of Vilna that was the result of the studies and the attitudes of a very famous rabbi who is called the Gaon of Vilna.
The Gaon's legacy of scholarship, both religious and secular, came to permeate all of Vilna. But today, Vilna's most sacred places have vanished. This patch of soil was once the most important Jewish landmark in the entire city. For centuries, this was the site of the Great Synagogue of Vilna. Destroyed by the Nazis, the ruins were leveled by the Soviets, who sealed them away by building a school on top. Only fragments survive in museums today. Some of those fragments were recovered in 2011, when Lithuanian archaeologists dug 3 excavation pits next to the modern school.
The goal was to pinpoint more precisely the location of the Great Synagogue itself and the main architectural features of the synagogue.
The excavations uncovered pieces of the main worship area.
What's amazing is it was right here where the Ark sat. And they found the column base and the steps leading up to the main bema where the Torah was read.
Today, much of the worship area lies buried under the school, but the complex was far larger.
We've got to look at this whole complex as a sort of community center. You would have been coming in from the Jewish street over there. You would have been walking down Jewish Street, coming in through the main courtyard.
Dating back to the 16th century, the Great Synagogue was not the only synagogue in the city. In fact, there were more than 100. Then, as now, Judaism was diverse, ranging from ultra-Orthodox to secular. But the Great Synagogue, more than any other, was integral to the identity of Vilna.
It was unmatched. There was nothing like it.
The complex housed the world-famous library, kosher meat butchers, and a communal well. It also held another critical structure, the mikveh, the ritual bath required for observant Jews.
It potentially could be one of the oldest parts of the structure, so that's a really important aspect of the whole complex.
Based on historical diagrams, John Seligman suspects the mikveh is under the playground. For the archaeological team, it is an appealing target.
Mikvahs are great places to excavate because people lose all their personal items when they're going into the bath.
Recovering this lost world is a personal mission for many on the team. Lithuanian archaeologists, Israeli volunteers, American students.
For me personally, my goal was to be able to contribute to mankind and be able to say that I did something.
For lead archaeologist John Seligman, the investigation is even more significant. His family once lived here.
So this, for them, would have been the place they would have looked up to as the most important place within their own community.
Most of them were murdered in the killing pits of Ponar.
Looking over my shoulder, there's my grandfather, maybe thinking, good on you. And so for me, that's something of great meaning.
With no clues visible from the surface, the search for the mikveh begins with a technology known as ground-penetrating radar. Harry Joel is the team's GPR expert.
So ground-penetrating radar, or known as GPR, uses FM radio waves, just like we're listening to in the car here. We're actually putting those waves into the ground. They're reflecting off of surfaces, and that's what we're seeing in the radar.
By measuring how quickly the signals are reflected back to the unit, GPR can reveal features in the ground that don't look natural.
Particularly in archaeological, you're looking for those right corners. Nothing in nature builds anything with a right corner. And so we can figure out a feature that has a right corner. We can say, oh, that's a building, that's human.
With scanning complete, the data is sent to California for processing while the team sleeps. By morning, the results are ready.
The data just came back, and what we're seeing here in these slices is some straight lines, and they're coming at right angles. The only thing that these could be is potential walls.
Joel hands the data over to cartographer Phil Reeder.
We'd look for all the existing maps and diagrams, and then what we're able to do is we're able to overlay them on top of each other, get everything in the same scale, and then we can add our data to that.
When the GPR data is matched against the floor plan of the complex from before the war, the team knows exactly where to start. The first loads of soil go into the sifters. And almost immediately, artifacts appear.
And now we have silverware. I don't think we're in a kitchen, although the possibility is that somebody was actually cooking here because there's coals, there's burnt wood.
Coins, pottery, tiles from the large heating stoves that once stood here.
You'd have like a stove which would be stoked from below and would be heating up the water. And the room itself, the room would have to be warm as well. I mean, you're talking Lithuania today, it's a nice sunny day, but in the winter over here, it's miserable. It's fantastic, and it's beautifully decorated.
The tiles from the heater suggest they may be close to the mikveh, close to discovering a key part of the great synagogue that was burned and bombed by the Germans during the war. In 1941, the 70,000 Jews of Vilna found themselves trapped. There was no escaping the Nazis.
And then, of course, a sudden occupation of the Nazi Germany. So there was no much time to run away from Lithuania.
And there were a few trains which left Vilnius, but many traveled on foot, and they couldn't even cross old Soviet Lithuanian borders. They had no proper documents.
It was like a nightmare. No doctors, no going to school, no walking on the sidewalks, no food. The Germans immediately told us that we had to be marked, so we put on the yellow Star of David.
Soon, the door-to-door searches began, and people started disappearing.
And this is a time, it's late June, early July, 1941, when Vilnius is a very dangerous place for Jews. They snatch from streets, they are taken by so-called harpoons. This is Yiddish word for people who are catching.
10 weeks after the invasion, the remaining Jews were forced into one of two ghettos, including young Samuel Bach.
One day, the Lithuanian police came and said, you just take with you what you can carry and go out into the street.
In one apartment, like 50 people here, one by the other, one by the other.
One Saturday morning, my mama heard screaming. She opened the door, and there was an elderly man from my street being shoved. These barbarians were pushing an old man. Then they went after my friend, Nahama was her name. She had a sister and a baby and parents, and the little girl was crying. So they bayoneted her and threw her out.
Children were regularly targeted.
My sister was 2 years younger than her. Her name is Shenele. Shenele in Hebrew, it means Yafa. In English, it's beauty. And she was really beauty. The next morning when I kissed her, I said to her, I will never see you again. And I didn't see her again. It was my last time that I saw her, like an angel.
My mother was brave. I don't understand it. She went to work, but she would hide me in an attic. And she would go to work. I was hungry, and she would always tell me, not a word, you have to stay quietly. And she was hiding me out. And this is how I lived for what I thought was a long, long time.
Also hiding inside the ghetto was a group of Jewish rebels determined to fight back, known as the FPO, or simply the Partisans. Their leader was a man named Abba Kovner.
It's no coincidence it's in Lithuania, it's in Vilna, that we first see somebody like Kovner who says, this is not isolated. This is something that is going to happen to every Jew in Europe.
The partisans began to stockpile weapons, hoping to hold on until the Soviets returned to drive the Nazis out. In 1943, the FPO snuck out of the ghetto through the sewers. They began launching attacks on Nazi targets in the forests around the city, including Ponar. By this time, the Nazi execution site here had been active for 2 years. About 70,000 Jews had been murdered, along with thousands of suspected communists and other people the Nazis deemed enemies. The burial pits were nearly full. It was damning evidence, and the Russians were coming.
By December of 1943, the Nazis knew that the Russians were on the border, ready to take back Lithuania. They had committed, by that time, nearly 100,000 atrocities, meaning the people had been shot and they were kept in these burial pits, but they now needed the evidence to disappear into ash.
Only a few thousand Jews were left in prisons and small labor camps in the area. The Nazis gathered 80 of the healthiest and brought them to Ponar, not to be shot, but to work. Much later, their children learned the story of their ordeal.
He was the youngest one, my father. There were 80 people that worked. There were 4 women that were in the kitchen.
During the first months, they were asked to cut down trees, and they were not told what the trees were to be used for. Towards the end of 1943, somewhere in December, the beginning of 44, they were told what the purpose of those logs were.
The German commandant of Ponar said, the reason that we brought you here is because all these Lithuanians committed these horrific crimes against the Jews, and we want you to clean that up.
Their job would be to dig them out and burn them.
Dig out the thousands of bodies and burn them.
The diggers, the burners, everybody had their own task. The younger people were charged with pulling out the gold teeth.
He said the corpses were already decomposed, but he recognized some of them by the clothes. I think he found his 2 children, I'm not sure, but I know for sure that he found his wife and he found his other family members. They used to burn, he said, about 200 corpses on each layer of wood, of logs. They used to put like 10 layers, so it was about 2,000 corpses plus or minus a day.
He said that in one big hole, they counted between 22 to 25,000 bodies. My father said, you can try to imagine what you can't imagine it.
The stacks of bodies were so large, ramps were needed to build the topmost layers.
This is the burning brigade's bridge that they used, and they would be able to grab the bodies and then they would be able to throw them onto pyres.
As a child, I remember him waking up and shouting, Lithuanian pajarne, which is fire or something like this, burning of fire. He was really haunted by those pictures.
כנראה הוא לא רצה לפגוע בנפשות הצעירות שלנו.
She says that, in fact, her father didn't tell very much. He actually was silent most of the time. And he would sit silently and chain smoke.
My father afterwards kept on washing hands all the time.
And in December, January, they all realized, those 80 Jews, 76 men, 4 women, that when they're finished, they would be the last victims. So they hatched a plan.
He said that all we thought is that someone will survive and tell the world what's going on, what happened here.
And they started digging an escape tunnel for 76 days.
He said there were 2 of them at the time. One would dig and another one would ferry the dirt back into the bunker.
אחרי מלחמה,
She says that the candle they were using for lighting would go out. There wasn't enough oxygen to keep the candle going, so my father set up a electrical system with the light bulb.
The tunnel, despite being small, had to be correctly engineered. One had to understand the distribution of pressure and so on. My grandfather had a degree in engineering and could be useful in the construction.
These stories testify to the existence of a tunnel. But so many years later, can it be found?
We do a lot of tunnel detection, and it's really difficult, and especially a tunnel like that where it's hand dug, it's small, there's nothing in it, there's no metal supports, it's surrounded by sand. Very improbable.
But can new technology help?
So when I come to these projects, I don't expect everything to work and us to find everything we're looking for. I just want to have some success.
The team has only one clue to go on. A Lithuanian excavation in 2004 that identified the entrance.
The entrance to the tunnel was found in the original excavations they did, but they couldn't find the continuation of the tunnel. That was the key.
The first thing the geophysics team needs to figure out is the direction the tunnel would take if ever completed. Architect Ken Ben-Simon spent his career designing prisons.
Our design was to prevent escapes and to prevent the design of tunnels.
Ruling out where the Lithuanians already excavated, and knowing the diggers would not have backtracked across the pit, Ben-Simon has flagged an area for examination. And on their very first run, the team gets a surprise.
Wow, it's exactly there.
One hotspot stands out. It looks like the cross-section of a collapsed tunnel. About 130 feet away from the previously discovered entrance, back in the pit. Most of the soil, colored blue, is too dry and sandy to conduct electricity very well. But the soil in the collapsed tunnel is looser and holds more moisture, conducting more electricity and generating the signal they see on their screens.
It rains here a lot. Here you even have a ditch leading into it where it's collapsed. And even if it's collapsed, it's not going to be as compact as the original sand that was laid down.
Okay.
It's not definitive, though. They need to verify this signal is a segment of a tunnel. So they decide to scan the entrance found in 2004 and check if the images match.
So this is the area where the tunnel began. The entrance is about 4 feet below where I'm standing right now.
Though the pit is empty today, A small hut stood here, later sketched by one of the survivors.
They were told to build their own living quarters, and basically said that the German commandant of Ponar said, "This is where you will live."
Climbing out of the pit to escape was impossible.
The Germans put a lot of mines, so they could not really try and escape. And he always described that at the end of the day, they were brought down with a ladder to the bottom of the pit. The ladder was taken out, was taken away, so there was no way they could climb it up.
Their only chance at freedom was to dig through the floor.
And they had like a cupboard, and the cupboard used to cover the entrance to the tunnel.
This is what the geophysics team will scan for. When they process their data, the tunnel entrance inside the pit shows up clearly, in exactly the same spot where the Lithuanian team found it in 2004.
Oh my God.
There's a resistivity section. We have a slightly more conductive anomaly.
Equally important, the signal matches the first reading they got 130 feet away, roughly the length of the tunnel, according to the survivors' stories.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Now we know exactly what we're looking for.
It seems they have the beginning and end of the tunnel. But can they find the rest of it?
Lots and lots of naysayers that will say any 2 points will make a line. Show me a third point. So yeah, I think we need a third point to convince everybody.
Months before the tunnel was begun, in September 1943, the Germans begin killing the last ghetto residents, a process known as liquidation.
So my mother, she always had another plan of what would happen. And she pushed me over like a wall or a hall or whatever. But you know what she said to me before in Yiddish? Mein Kind soll keinmal nicht vergessen, a bist a Jiddische, which means, my child, never forget that you're Jewish. And she pushed me out.
Sam Bach was taken with his father to a work camp. But for children, it was no safer than the ghetto.
So about 200 kids that were in the camp were killed. And my father brought me out to the gate of the camp, carrying me in a sack. Therefore, my last memory of my father is the feeling to be on his shoulder, is a kind of a physical feeling of his presence. I don't even know if the voice of somebody shouting, "Run, run, run," when they liberated me from the sack. I don't even know if it is his voice or somebody else's voice. But then he was just killed a few days before the Russians arrived.
In 1944, the Soviets drive out the Germans, annexing the country. They would rule for nearly 50 years. In the Great Synagogue yard, the archaeology team finds what appears to be a remnant of the Soviet era.
Yeah, do you know what it is?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, from the gun.
It was obviously shot because of the dots over there. I do believe it's Russian.
A Russian-made bullet from the post-Nazi era, when the few remaining Jews alongside other minorities had to endure the Soviets' attempt to stamp out their religion and culture.
It was not so easy in the Soviet time. They could not go to synagogue, but you know, the people were so anxious that they wanted to have their culture so much.
Fearing their precious artifacts would be destroyed by the Soviets, Jewish leaders sent them away. Today, one precious treasure has returned.
In 1960, my father came to Vilnius, where he met the leaders of what was left of the Jewish community. And at this meeting, they produced this scroll, and they pleaded with him to take it out to the West for safekeeping.
So that's extraordinary. These are valued possessions of every community. These really are the most important possessions of every Jewish community with the Torah scrolls.
The Torah will be authenticated while the team returns to work. They only have 2 days left on their permit to find and document the mikvah, the ritual bath, but they've uncovered an important clue.
We have an arch. You can see the bricks over here.
What kind of depth are we at right now?
Roughly 1.5 meters.
With the clock ticking, the team digs in shifts. And then a lucky break. Literally.
Oh my goodness.
They clear away a small hole.
If we can get in underneath, then we may have won the lottery.
How, you hit the floor?
Right now I did.
How much is that?
360.
360?
Yep.
That's deep. It's about 10 and a half feet.
The hole is just large enough to fit a GoPro camera.
You can see brickwork.
Wall?
Like a wall or something.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are going down.
I think that's pretty clear that's a heater. It looks like a water heater. We're standing in the corner of the vault. The line would continue more or less in a line to where Jogis is standing over there, and about 3 or 4 meters in that direction.
Yep.
And somewhere around about close to the back wall, we have a heater.
Yeah.
A metal heater, which is heating up water.
Yeah.
A water heater, likely for the bathhouse and mikvah.
That's the fun of archaeology, is you've got no idea what we're going to find down there.
No, it's the first time I actually see
Something
something
like that. Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's been a good day.
A good day indeed. They've found an intact piece of the great synagogue complex.
It's absolutely successful. We will find more, I hope, in the future, and that's the way archaeology works. You find a bit now, and you come back next year and you find the rest.
At Ponar Forest, where the Nazis murdered about 70,000 people, the geophysics team is within striking distance of finding the escape tunnel. They found 2 cross-sections, but they need more evidence to prove that it was actually completed and used.
I'm going to split the difference between these two. Yeah.
A sudden rainstorm might actually help.
It's a lot easier to get current into wet sand than dry sand, so the rain actually works in our favor.
If they find it, they will have tangible proof for what have been only stories handed down from the survivors to their children.
Their accounts are riveting because they give us detail. And on the last night of Passover, April 15th, between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock, they knew that there was great danger, but they were going to try to get through the forest without making too much noise.
The guards heard the steps, and that's when they start shooting.
guards started firing indiscriminately. They didn't see anybody, didn't know who they were firing at. My father was able to climb out of there and start running.
Of the 80 prisoners, only 11 escaped and made it through the war.
It is one of the most horrific escapes that we have in the Holocaust. But it also is, I mean, the great testament to the courage and survival.
Once in the forest, they were found by Abba Kovner and the partisans. Some joined the fight against the Nazis.
My father said, we wanted to fight, we wanted revenge.
Years later, Abe Gall's father ended up in America. The engineer, Yerli Farber, returned to his birthplace in Russia. Hannah's father, Motki Seidel, settled in Israel, as did Chaim's father and the rest of the survivors. For decades, their words were the only evidence for the tunnel. Now, modern technology is about to prove the story true.
The inversion's finished?
Yep.
Because there on the screen appears the third piece of their tunnel.
Yeah, this is astounding. Like, as good as we possibly could have hoped for.
That's our third point.
Oh my God. 2 feet.
We've found a major part of the tunnel. And there's something extremely personally moving about knowing what these people must have gone through in those 76 days.
2 last scans provide the final confirmation.
So the tunnel is many feet below where I'm standing right now. It extended at about the same level under this hill, out in this direction. Our technology indicates it's approximately on this alignment under this hill and continued for about 90 to 100 feet. And the exit is somewhere beyond this area here.
The news of the discovery soon makes international headlines, reaching the survivors' children in Israel, who are eager to see the proof of their father's stories.
לחסות את ההורה שלו במלט או זה מזעזע.
You see all the blue? That's sand. And we have 5 slices that we did of the tunnel.
Where is the entrance to the tunnel?
The tunnel is at the corner here.
It's just like my father, he used to do with the hands. We dug just like this, just behind the kitchen.
This is a very special opportunity to look at what happened at that place.
It was something that you felt was really unreal, and you thought, well, they mystified some of it. And then everything is here.
The moment I saw it, I was shocked.
This actually closes a full circle for me. Absolutely.
Modern technology has brought them the closure they thought they would never have. But the civilization known as Vilna is gone. More than 95% of the Jewish community of Vilnius was destroyed, and thousands of other lives were taken. A vital culture, hundreds of years old, embodied by the great synagogue at its center, is extinguished. The Torah scroll, back from safekeeping, has been authenticated. It is one of the last surviving pieces of Vilna, now kept in one of the city's only active synagogues. As time passes, memories of Vilna and its people will fade and die out. But the truth of what happened here has not been forgotten. And now, through the proof that science has given us, it will never be erased.
Major funding for NOVA is provided by the following.
Do people tell you that you've got your mom's eyes or your dad's toes? 23andMe.com is a genetic service that provides personalized reports about traits, health, and ancestry, and can help you understand why you are who you are. Learn more at 23andMe.com.
Learn more at cancercenter.com.
The David H. Koch Fund for Science, supporting NOVA and promoting public understanding of science. And the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by PBS viewers like you, thank you. Additional funding from Margie and Robert Cartman. And the Steve Perry Foundation.
The exploration continues on NOVA's website, where you can watch this and other NOVA programs. See expert interviews, interactives, video extras, and more. Follow NOVA on...
Well, thank you. What an incredibly powerful film. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Bauman. If you're looking for an escape tunnel, a bunker in the Warsaw Ghetto, physical evidence of Nazi atrocities, or drinking water for Rohingya refugees, Paul Bauman has searched for all of these and much, much more. Paul is the principal geophysicist of the Near Surface Geophysics Group at BGC Engineering in Calgary. Originally from Boston and of Litvak ancestry, Paul has 35 years of geophysical exploration experience in the environmental engineering, water resource, and humanitarian and archaeology sectors. Paul has a BSc in geological engineering from Princeton, a minor in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton, and a master's in science in earth sciences from the University of Waterloo. Recognizing that over the next decade, there will be very few new Holocaust survivor testimonies, Paul has pioneered the use of subsurface geophysical investigations to continue our understanding of the Holocaust. Some of his archaeo-geophysical projects, which have been featured in a number of movies and television documentaries, including the National Geographic television special, Finding Atlantis, 2 NOVA documentaries, Ancient Refuge in the Holy Land, and the film you've just seen, Holocaust Escape Tunnel, the joint Israeli and Canadian production, The Good Nazi, and the upcoming documentaries, Deadly Deception at Sobibor and They Fought Back. Most recently, in July of 2021, Paul and his colleagues carried out investigations in Warsaw in support of the planned Warsaw Ghetto Museum, including the iconic bunker of the Jewish resistance at Mila 18 and the site of the brushmakers factory where the Warsaw Ghetto uprising began.
Great. Well, thank you, Belle. That was fantastic seeing. That was my 3rd time seeing Holocaust Escape Tunnel. I haven't seen it for over a year. I think they put in different archival footage, and it was almost like seeing it fresh for the first time. Of all those movies that were listed, I can tell you this is certainly the best of them. I congratulated Paula Aspo, who's the executive producer on the movie. I asked her. She was executive producer for NOVA. She did 371 features for NOVA, and she told me she wasn't sure if it was her best movie, but it was certainly the most emotive of all the NOVA documentaries she made. So originally I was going to talk a little bit more about Ponar, but the movie does such a good job and so complete, I decided to step back to 2008. And this is really where we begin, the first investigation, systematic archaeological investigation of a Holocaust extermination site, and the first use of geophysics on such a site. And of course, it's becoming more important now as we move further and further from the Holocaust and World War II, and there's fewer and fewer survivors, and science will certainly play a big role in the future of furthering our understanding of these atrocity sites as well. And somewhat surprisingly, despite testimonies, archival research, there's actually been very little systematic investigation of the physical remains of these and the subsurface remains of these atrocity sites. So we're going to go to the site where this first archaeological investigation occurred, and that's the Sobibor site. And the reason Sobibor was picked, because this was the site of the PhD thesis of Yoram Chaimi, pictured here on the left, along with his Polish colleague, Wojtek Mazurek. And Yoram was and is an archaeologist with the Israel Antiquities Authority. His specialty actually is Paleolithic studies, so ancient Stone Age culture, nothing to do with Holocaust studies. But the Israel Antiquities Authority, so many archaeologists in Israel, they require that all senior archaeologists get a PhD, and a PhD outside of their expertise. So Yoram decided to take some of this expertise, this modern scientific approach of doing archaeology to a Holocaust study. And why did he pick Sobibor? Well, Yoram had two uncles during the war that were studying photography in Paris. And they were rounded up in the Paris roundup at Drancy and put on a train, Convoy 53, sent to Auschwitz. And quite literally, the gas chambers were full, and the train carried on to Sobibor, where they were exterminated on the very same day of their arrival. Sobibor today, it looks very much like I imagine it looked 80 years ago. It's a fairly remote part of Poland in the far east, bordering Belarus and the Ukraine. Still very bucolic, very you'd say backward. When we were there in 2008, in fact, there were still many small village homes that still had thatch roofs. In fact, this is also a good reason why it's such a good site for initial investigations like this, because the site's still relatively undisturbed. Of course, Sobibor, along with Majdanek and Treblinka, these were the camps that were part of Operation Reinhardt. So as the movie just discussed, the Holocaust initially began in Lithuania, quite literally in Ponar, when the Germans attacked the Russians in 1941, ripping up the Molotov-Ribbentrop Compact. And initially, in the initial portion of the Holocaust, was referred to in the movie as the Holocaust by bullets, about 1.5 million Jews were executed by shooting and buried in pits. But later on in 1941, at the 1C conference, the Germans drew up their plans for this mechanized killing for their final solution. And as part of that, they built 3 camps. These camps were unlike other camps that were also horrible places where millions of people died, but these other concentration camps, labor camps, work camps, people who essentially worked to death. These 3 camps, the Reinhardt camps, Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, they were designed for only one reason: to kill and process human beings. Typically, someone would arrive at a camp and they would be dead in about 40 minutes. So of course, we have a lot of information about these camps, again, from archives, from testimonies, and you can physically go there, various pieces of documentation. But in terms of the enumeration of how many people died in these camps, we have only one piece of enumeration from the Nazis themselves. And this was a 1942 telex going from Subcommander Huffler to Adolf Eichmann. And it actually listed out the number of people dead as of the end of year, December 31st, 1942. And at the end, we estimate that 850,000 Jews died in Treblinka. There were 67 survivors. Those were escapees in a revolt shortly before the liquidation of the camp. 450,000 Jews were killed in Belzec, with only 2 escapees. And as of the end of December 1942, 101,370 Jews were killed in Sobibor. Eventually, 250,000 Jews would die in Sobibor. On the left, we actually see a manifest, a train manifest from Convoy 53 that has the names Yoram's two uncles. And we actually know a large number from these train manifests, a large number of the names of the people who died in Sobibor. Operations at Sobibor ended very abruptly on October 14th at 4 o'clock, 1943. It was at that moment a revolt began that was planned by two workers at the camp, two Jews that had been kept alive, along with about 500 others to carry out operations at the camp. That's Leon Feldhandler, pictured on the right, played by Alan Arkin, and what I'd say is the better of the two movies, the 1987 movie Escape from Sobibor. And the other leader of the revolt was Sasha Pachersky. He was a Russian Jewish POW that came to the camp about 2 months before the revolt. There's also a Russian movie, Sobibor, came out in 2017 that has much more political bent. The 87 movie I would say, is more true to the history. So how did the escape proceed? Well, it was designed to be very simple. At exactly 4 o'clock, a small group of Jews that out of the 500 that knew about the escape attempt would one by one kill hopefully all 20 of the SS officers. So it initially began, one came in into one of the barracks. He was trying on a pair of boots that had been taken from a victim. His throat was cut. Another came in to try on a jacket. His head was cut with an axe, and things proceeded as such until about 12 of the Nazi SS officers were killed. At that point, one of the Ukrainian guards, and about 80 Ukrainian guards and 20 SS officers, one of the Ukrainian guards identified a corpse, sounded the alarm, and all hell broke loose. Machine gun fire came out from the guard tower. Shooting was everywhere. Pachersky, at that point, surrounded by Jews, and most of whom had no idea what was going on, gave a short speech saying, now is the time for escape. Now is the time to stop murdering our brothers and sisters. And now is the time to kill the Nazis. And whoever would escape from Sobibor and survive to the end of the war, their duty was to tell the world what was happening here. So at that point, Jews rushed for the gate, they rushed for the fence, they pushed down the fence, they cut holes, they pushed open the gate. Of the 500 that were able to breach the fence, about 150 were shot or blew up in the minefields, about 300 escaped to the woods, and of those, 250 were recaptured or killed by Polish partisans or killed by villages themselves. So about 50 survived to the end of the war. Following the escape, the SS knew that the secret of what was happening in these extermination camps, and especially Sobibor, was out. So they proceeded to destroy the camp. They blew up the gas chambers, they brought in mining machinery, they dug holes, they destroyed all the other barracks, all the other killing machinery. They excavated unburnt remains, and similar to as was talked about in the movie at Ponar, they cremated the remains of any of the corpses, of any of the tens of thousands of corpses that were exhumed. They brought in farming machinery, they plowed the field, and they planted a pine forest. They also destroyed all the air photos, and most of the surviving SS were actually killed in the Russian front. But we know a bit of what the architecture looks like because maps were made by survivors and testimonies. So here's a map on the right that was made by Pachersky. And in fact, there's more than 30 different maps of the camp, made not only by survivors, but also by SS officers, by Ukrainian guards. And I've seen most of these, and every single one is different. And some are, in fact, spectacularly different. Why is this? Well, none of them dispute that this was a camp for killing. None of them dispute that there were gas chambers here. But of course, people have different memories. Memories aren't perfect. And people saw different parts of the camp, especially the Jews. For no Jew that worked in the killing portion of the camp came out of the camp alive. So in the top left, we have a drawing by Eric Bauer. he became known as the Gasmeister. He was a sub-commander that actually operated the gas chambers. He was in prison for 30 years from 1950 to 1980 when he died. This is probably the most accurate of the maps. In the bottom left, we have a map drawn by Jules Shelvis. He was the only person to survive in his transport from Amsterdam, more than 3,000 people. He became a very well-known and quite famous, actually, among Holocaust historians. He died at the age of 93. And on the right, we have a map that was drawn by Jacob Biskowitz. He drew this map of the Eichmann trials in 1961. But you can see each of these maps is quite different, as is true with the other 30 or so. So what did the camp look like? Well, again, we don't have any aerial photographs contemporary with the camp. The closest we have to the contemporary operation of the camp is this May 1944 photo that was taken by the Luftwaffe. We also have photos from before the operations of the camp that were taken by the Luftwaffe in the planning stage. And what we see is what was described by all the inmates. It wasn't really a camp. It was actually 5 camps. Or as the Jews described, as many Jews described in their testimonies, you were living in a cage within a cage. For each of these subcamps was surrounded by barbed wire fences as well as minefields. So what do we have? We have the Vorlager in the south. That's where the SS officers, the Ukrainian guards lived, and that's where people were greeted literally by musical bands, sometimes by food, as they came off the trains, coming from Holland, from Poland, from France. And then you have Camp 1. That's where the 500 or so Jews that actually operated the camp, that were kept alive to work the camp, that's where they lived. And that was surrounded by multiple barbed wire fences, as well as a moat filled with human excrement, as well as a minefield. Camp 2 is where humans were processed, often their physical remains, such as hair, as well as their whatever articles they brought. So baggage, cash, documents, jewelry, so forth, whatever they came with to the camp. There was warehousings there were barracks for processing materials. And then finally we had Camp 3, where the gas chambers and all the killing facilities were located. And then there was also Camp 4. And Camp 4 was where Russian ammunition was reprocessed to be used as in Soviet military armaments. So Yoram, when he first went to excavate at Sobibor in 2007, he had this air photo, and it was assumed that that square area, that dark and black square area in Camp 3 was the gas chambers, what remained of the gas chambers after they were blown out. So with this air photo, this map, the railroad line, he thought it would be really easy. Just walk right over there, open up some squares, and start digging. But you have to remember, these air photos don't have the georeferencing, the precise coordinate positioning that we have with today's modern air photos with the aids of satellite navigation and GPS. And this is what the forest would have looked like, or did look like, when Yoram began excavating there. And you'll notice that all the trees are exactly the same diameter. All the trees have the same number of tree rings because they were all planted by the Nazis over the site of the camp. And in 2008, when I was there, it's astounding. Many people would come to this camp, come to this site, but not out of memorialization, not out of remembrance. It's this beautiful pine forest in a bucolic part of Poland. They would come to mountain bike to walk through the woods. So Yoram started digging. You can see it's a pretty significant size excavation, maybe 50 by 50 meters. And what did he find? Well, he found neither gas chambers, nor any evidence of the gas chambers, nor any evidence of mass burials. Now, most archaeologists and historians, and I'm neither an archaeologist or historian, I'm a geophysicist, but archaeologists or historians, they wouldn't be so disturbed by this, because they would say, why are we doing this here? There's no historical question. We have testimony, we have eyewitnesses. Of course, this was a concentration camp. Of course, hundreds of thousands of people were murdered here, and they were murdered by gassing. But and the archaeology is being done to complete the architecture of the camp, to recover artifacts, to provide the details of what happened here. But as a non-historian or non-archaeologist, I would say, in fact, it's critical to find the gas chambers, find these killing fields, because and especially as we're moving beyond the lives of most survivors, this is the kind of thing that Holocaust deniers love to see. You say there's gas chambers, show me a gas chamber. You say there's mass burials, show me these burials. And then when archaeologists go dig and find nothing, that's complete fodder for Holocaust deniers. Now, they did find artifacts in the course of that dig. They found over 1,000 artifacts. And probably the most encouraging in terms of looking for the gas chambers was in one of the 5 by 5 meter squares where scissors, razors, knives were found. And these were likely associated with barbershop where women, and there was also another barracks for men where their hair was removed for later processing by the Nazis. But without these actual physical remains of either mass burials or gas chambers, Yoram contacted me, and Yoram had seen some of the geophysical work I'd been doing in Israel from 2000 to 2007 on various archaeological sites around the country. And he was hoping that I could help better position excavations for the 2008 season and onwards. So for 1 week, and only 1 week, in July of 2008, myself and a colleague, Brad Hansen, we went to Sobibor. And the first thing we did was take the aerial photos from 1944, post-destruction of the camp, and aerial photos from 1940, Luftwaffe photos from 1940. And the 1940 photo is in the inner square. And we identified features that existed before the camp operation, during the camp operation, and exist today. So for instance, the base of the forestry tower, the post office, the rail station. And the idea was to then take those features and survey them, precisely survey them using modern GPS, geospatial positioning, and then use that information to correct those aerial photos from 1944. So for instance, here we're looking at the Vorlager, where the SS and the Ukrainians lived, and we're looking at this tower. This isn't a guard tower, it's a forest fighting tower, forestry tower. It says 3 legs, it's a tripod. You can see it in 1942 at the camp, and you can still walk to that foundation today. So I surveyed the 3 corners of that foundation. In 2008, I went crashing through the woods looking for the moat, and it was there approximately where you'd expect it. The moat's filled no longer with human excrement, but that would have surrounded Camp 1, and I mapped that moat in. The railway siding is still the same siding. The rail stop at the end of the stop is still the same stop. And the house of Commander von Stengel is still there. The house was there before the camp, during the camp, and it's still there today with a family living on it. Stengel actually was caught. He was identified in 1967 in Brazil. In Brazil, he was working in a Volkswagen factory. He was extradited to Germany. He went on trial. He was convicted for the murder of 1 million people because he was the commander of both Sobibor and then of Treblinka. Although he actually died after only 6 months in prison of ill health. But anyways, with all this positioning information, we then went back to those 1944 photos, and we did what you say, rubber sheeting. We stretched them, we bent them, we shrunk them, we made them fit the precise positioning that we had from that survey data. And at that point, we still didn't have a perfectly georeferenced map, but we had something a lot better than Yoram had from these points we had. And then we were hoping we would lay out 8 grids. We laid out 8 grids that we thought would lie over the gas chambers based on our correction, our recalibration of that air photo. At that point, we laid down these rope grids, 20 by 20 meter grids, so 8 400 square meter areas. And we surveyed the heck out of them with ground penetrating radar to look for trenches, terrain conductivity mapping to look for non-ferromagnetic metal, so silver, bronze, brass. This is an EM61, very high resolution metal detector that was developed for looking for unexploded bombs and shrapnel. So we collected data over those 8 grids, and this is generally what we got from all of the instruments. And what you see doesn't particularly look like anything. It doesn't look like a particular structure. It doesn't look like any type of morphological feature that you might be able to associate with any type of architecture of any time. Largely, the instruments are responding to buried metal. And even with this map, we really had no idea this metal had anything to do with the operation of the camp, because again, this is a heavily recreated area where we're looking at bicycle spokes and beer cans and vodka tops. And so initially, before we got, before we thought too hard about this data set, we randomly picked out 12 targets and excavated them very quickly. And what we found was that each and every one of those targets directly related to the operation of the camp. So for instance, this is a small spike, and this would have been a spike that would have been used in the small narrow gauge rail that the Nazis built, and that rail was for taking infirm Jews from the rail siding directly to the gas chamber, and then taking victim bodies from the corpses from the gas chambers to the mass graves. And this, of course, is the iconic soup bowl that if you go to Auschwitz or any number of other concentration camps, you'll see rooms of thousands of those. So we knew we clearly had evidence of the concentration camps, of the mass killing, but not the targets we were looking for, or at least not from those data sets. But the data set that was the most useful was from this instrument. This is a magnetometer, and it's a very, very sensitive magnetometer. And actually, you can see Brad's walking in bare feet because we don't even want to see the eyelets in our boots. The magnetometer maps only ferromagnetic material. And the most interesting part of the data set here are these 4 circles in a line. And these we interpreted as being piles for foundations for the gas chamber, because we knew that only the gas chamber would have been built on a foundation. All the other buildings would have been built on the ground. The reason the gas chambers would have been on a foundation with dense piles was because, of course, the rooms were packed with people, and because the chamber would be lifted above the floor to make it easier to remove the corpses. So we excavated after the geophysicists, myself and Brad left, and a year later, Yoram excavated these piles that we had mapped. In fact, they were piles, they were posts, as you can see here, but they weren't the gas chambers. They were the posts and piles that demarcated Camp 3. However, by continuing to excavate along that line of the piles demarcating the fence line along Camp 3, that led to the Himmelfahrtstrasse, the cynical name that the Nazis gave of the 4 parallel fences that led from the railroad siding to the gas chambers. Himmelfahrtstrasse means the road to heaven. So they had 4 fences. The inner fences, they were interwoven with pine boughs so people could not see from the outside inward, and the victims could not see from the inside outward as they were marched unsuspectingly towards the undressing barracks and into the gas chambers. And in 2014, finally, after years of waiting for permits, the gas chambers were actually excavated. And I'll show you an interpretive overlay in the next slide. But here we're looking down directly on the excavations of the gas chambers. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we have the 4 chambers of the older gas chambers, a 3-meter wide corridor, 4 new larger chambers that were built. We have a large room at the north end that where the gas was produced, and it wasn't Zyklon B. They had a tank engine here that produced carbon monoxide. And then you have another room at the south end where bodies were removed, pushed off the platform into rail cars and taken to the mass grave. And here's the actual here's a more clear interpretation that allows you to visualize what was there. And indeed, there was a foundation for the gas chambers, but it was a raised brick foundation. So besides the actual gas chambers, of course, many artifacts were uncovered during the excavations and the exposure of the gas chamber. And very, very tragically, very movingly, most of these artifacts were the types of artifacts that people would have to the very last moments of their lives. So for instance, keys to their luggage, dentures, rings. The ring in the bottom, you actually see the inside of the ring. It says Mikudeshetli. And what the full inscription on this wedding ring says, Harayat Mikudeshetli Betabat. So behold, with this ring, this ring sanctifies you to me. Once we felt that we had at least located, and actually in 2008 we felt we were confident we had identified the gas chambers. We then carried out surveys between what we thought were the gas chambers, but nevertheless turned out to be the boundary of Camp 3, the killing area, and the monument scene you see in the back. This is called the Monument of Ashes. It was constructed by the Polish government in 1965. Supposedly it's filled with ashes. It's not clear. It certainly was not clear that it was actually placed on or even necessarily near where the actual mass graves were. So we carried out a range of surveys to identify mass graves, individual graves, and of course trenches infilled with ashes. Of course, from what we understand, in 1942, the Nazis began the cremation of exhumation and cremation of the bodies and then reburial of the ashes, as they did in Ponar. Now you have to remember, this is 2008. This is long before a lot of not only a lot of high resolution satellite imagery we have available, but it's long before commercial application of drones. But nevertheless, wanting to have good aerial imagery, I built this radio controlled helium balloon photography system. So raised radio controlled cameras from the balloon, and we took photographs over the entire camp. And in fact, this was very spectacularly successful in identifying and very diagnostically identifying the areas of mass, especially the mass burials and the trenches of ashes. And those are quite clear on the aerial photograph on the left, these darker green areas in proximity, and actually not necessarily extending under, but in proximity to the Monument of Ashes. These trenches were confirmed by the radar, and they were actually later confirmed by excavation by URM over the following years from, I think, 2009 to 2011. And the mass graves are outlined on the right in the figure. What we also identified with the magnetics is a lot of metal anomalies. Now, after we eliminated all the ones that were from surface metal, that were from utilities running to the Monument of Ashes, we were left with this square metal anomaly. And this, very tragically, we correctly interpreted what we knew it existed from some of the testimonies. The manner in which the SS destroyed the evidence, the manner in which they destroyed the body was to build these outdoor crematorium that they would build from railroads. They would send work squads out in the night to actually steal railroads from other SS, rails from other SS repair crews, bring them to the camp and use these to construct these outdoor crematoria. And you can actually see some of the contorted rail in the museum, the Sobibor Museum that was built in 2020. What the excavations also uncovered in many areas were these plow lines. Again, evidence of the Nazis' efforts to plow the area after the destruction of the camp and hide the camp. But perhaps most movingly and perhaps most tragically, and again, certainly speaking to the movie you just saw, in 2011, Yoram and Wojtek, they uncovered a tunnel, an escape tunnel. And it was later identified in testimony, I believe it was at Nuremberg, that there was rumor, because nobody from Camp 3 survived, but there was rumor of this escape tunnel that the Jews in the barracks of Camp 3, the Jews that were actually the Sonderkommandos that were physically operating the gas chambers and that were physically physically shaving the victims to the gas chambers, they knew they would not get out alive. So they dug this tunnel, and it's believed that the tunnel was almost complete, but the rumor that came from some of the escapees was that in September there were heavy rains and the tunnel flooded. And a month before the actual escape attempt, unfortunately, those Jews working in Barracks 3 were not able to use the tunnel. And even one of the tools used to dig the tunnel was identified in the excavation. So finally, just bringing this to a conclusion, I think we can all agree that archaeology is a destructive science. And what we're looking at down here is it's in the fall. I think this was shot in late October, just at the beginning of the first snowfall in Sobibor. And we can see what probably could never happen again, where there's been significant excavations to truth the burial trenches we mapped, to truth the trenches of ashes, as well as individual burials that we mapped around the monument of ashes. And of course, we need this physical evidence to prove exactly what occurred here. But we don't necessarily need this much physical evidence. Archaeology in itself often destroys what it's trying to show. It's a very destructive science. But nevertheless, I think we can see that one of the futures of Holocaust studies will certainly be more geophysics, because it's a way to further identify what actually physically happened, what transpired in these sites. And still likely some excavations will occur to truth the geophysics, but certainly not as extensive as occurred at Sobibor. And today, in fact, it's even impossible to carry out further excavations because I would say somewhat unfortunately, the entire burial area has now been covered with stone. So it's no longer accessible to any type of intrusive investigation, but it's no longer accessible to all the non-intrusive, non-destructive techniques that we have now, for instance, multispectral imaging and LiDAR and other techniques that simply weren't available to us back in 2008. And still people go bicycling, and still people recreate in the forest and the pine forest surrounding Sobibor and around the camp. The camp was very large, it was about 25 hectares. But now, thanks to the new museum that was constructed in 2020, thanks to a better understanding of what happened at the camp, due to our geophysical investigations, due to the multiple years of excavations by Yoram Chaimi and Wojtek, and due to the many hundreds of artifacts that were found in the camp and are now on display, at least now as people bicycle and hike around the forest around Sobibor. At least there'll be more to them than just simply a recreation area. They'll know what happened here, and they'll be able to memorialize the site and remember the tragic events, the atrocities that occurred here between 1942 and 1943. Thank you everyone for attending the movie, watching the movie, and listening in on the talk. And I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions for anyone that wanted to stay around and had any.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that extraordinary presentation. This is such important work. We do have a couple of questions already, and I know I have a few of my own. How were the investigations funded?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, we myself and my colleague, Brad Hansen, we essentially donated all our time. And we have all the equipment, of course, we have. So we donated our equipment. University of, I believe it was the University of Hartford, and there were a number of private donors that provided funds that supported the disbursements for us. So we had to fly there, we had to stay places, we needed vehicles, all that. In terms of the excavations themselves, I think they were largely funded by, and the excavations have been went on from 2007 to I think 2014, maybe 2015. And those were largely funded by Yad Vashem. And they were also funded by a consortium of groups from 5 countries. And those were the 5 countries that had the largest number of victims at Sobibor. So that was Poland, Netherlands, France, and I think Germany, and a 5th country that escapes me right now.
And do you have any more of these investigations planned?
Yeah, I mean, we've been, since then, and again, this was really the first of its kind. It was really the initial foray using not just systematic archaeology, but using geophysics to investigate, or certainly to investigate an extermination camp, but also to investigate World War II atrocity sites. In 2017, as discussed in the movie, and again in 2018, and then in 2019 and 2021, this last summer, we carried out investigations at Holocaust sites, first in Lithuania, and then more sites in Poland, more sites in, and then sites in Latvia as well. And depending on interest and funding from whatever academic institutions, Yad Vashem, universities, governments, however they may want to proceed, we've always donated, 100% donated all our professional time, all our equipment, but if there's funding to support further investigations, which includes, of course, archaeologists, some various types of analyses, archival research, and so forth, yes, we certainly would look forward to further investigation at other sites.
That's wonderful. So I have some questions. I'm wondering, we know that the countries mentioned here have an issue as far as the way they are presenting the history of the Holocaust today, and a distortion of their own complicity. So did you meet with any resistance from the local governments, or even just the people that were in these areas when you were there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, and complex history, and even a question that varies over time. So I can tell you, certainly when we went there in 2008, I mean, the village of Sobibor really was a backwater. There was a tiny museum and there were a few memorial markers, but nobody went there. And yes, we got very strange looks from local people, and I would say even hostile looks. But it's hard to I don't want to extrapolate that to all of Poland. Of course, the history is complex. There were many people that were complicit in the Holocaust, of course, and of course there's more righteous Gentiles from Poland than from any other country. And then, like every country, including Canada and the U.S., you have a very mixed demographic. And I tell you, my experience in working in many sites in Poland is that Warsaw is a lot more liberal. The government's a lot more liberal. We've done a lot of work for the Warsaw Ghetto Museum. We've done work at the site of Mila 18 and the Warsaw Ghetto, and in the brush makers factory, in investigations looking for the Ringelblum archive. We've got very good support in Warsaw. And other sites outside of Warsaw, they're under different jurisdictions. So for instance, Sobibor is run by the Majdanek Museum. And there, yes, I mean, there we did this work in 2007, and we wanted to go back. I did go back to Sobibor in 2020, and I wanted to go back in 2019, and we were specifically not allowed to do any more work there. It's hard to interpret the reasons why, but one thing I'll say, I was very pleased to see when I was there in 2020. After 2008, I saw Yoram doing lots of excavations, and I contacted Yoram and I said, when are you going to get us back there? And he always said he was saving Camp 4 for us. They hadn't done any excavations in Camp 4. They wanted us come back there and do work. And when I was there in 2021, I'm sorry, this last summer, there was a Polish group from a university that was actually carrying out geophysical surveys at Camp 4. And my initial reaction and very, I guess, self-centered reaction was, hey, that's what I'm supposed to do. And that's my idea. But then after rethinking it for a few seconds, I realized this is a good thing, because I think Poles and Polish universities should be doing surveys in their country and remapping their history. And it's fantastic that they've taken over and they're running with some of the ideas that we first presented. I should also say every country's different. There's no, one of the messages I think you probably got out of the Holocaust escape tunnel is that in Lithuania, the Holocaust might not have proceeded as it did if the Nazis had not met such enthusiastic response from local Lithuanians. It was mentioned the actual shooting, the actual killing, much of the hands-on killing was done by volunteers from the Lithuanian Rifle Association. And certainly there was a strong history in all the Baltics of complicity in the mass murder, in the Holocaust by bullets. And if you go to these countries, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, of course you're faced with what they call, you're faced in very many places, memorialization of the genocide that occurred in those countries. But the word genocide has very different meanings to most people in the Baltics, because they look at genocide as what happened to them with the Soviet occupation from the 40s up until 1990. And they see themselves as victims, just as in a comparable way to as they would see, in a comparable way to the Jewish genocide, which certainly most historians, most archaeologists, and I'd say most people outside the Baltics would see very differently. So the history is different there. It's really only just being revealed now. You have to remember that during the Russian occupation, archives were sealed. No investigations of these kind were allowed. And if you would go to these sites, you would see no memorialization to Jewish victims, because from the Soviet perspective, there were no Jewish victims. These were victims. These were comrades, Russian comrades that were murdered by the Hitlerites, that were murdered by fascists. So in these countries, I would say the history is still very much being rewritten. But I'd also say too, I love going to Lithuania, to Latvia. It's very easy to talk to people, especially the younger generation, about what we're doing. People are friendly. We certainly faced no hostility, and Lithuania in particular, they've embraced the development of the Great Synagogue site. They've embraced development of the Ponar site. And it's a very sensitive time in Europe, as we know. Many of those governments there, including in Latvia, including Lithuania, especially in Poland, they're teetering between right-wing governments and left-wing governments. So I won't go on any more other than say, yes, it's a complex question with a very complex history and complex contemporary answer.
Thank you. Well, I see there are two other questions that have come in. Ashira Myers asks if you can give us an idea of how long it takes to do the magnetometer mapping, and is it important to moderate the pace of data collection to generate reliable and clear images? What kind of technical expertise is required? And are there challenges with applying it in different regions in terms of power or supplies required?
Yeah, that's a big question with a lot of technical feedback, but I'll tell you a couple of things. First, just from talk you saw, and we did a lot of different methods, and there were a lot of things going on, but over a week and really 5 days of investigation, we only did 5 20 by 20 meter squares. And it's not so much that it takes a lot of time to collect magnetics data, but what takes a lot of time is to collect it very slowly with proper positioning that gives you near centimeter positioning. But that was, even though it doesn't seem so long ago, that was
way back then, 2008. Now, the GPSs are so much more precise. They work so much better underneath tree canopy. The magnetometers are so much better. We can actually fly better magnetometers than we used then from drones and fly them at 40 kilometers an hour with much better GPS positioning. So it took, it's way faster than digging, because it can take, you can spend a whole summer on a 5 by 5 meter square, but nevertheless, what we did back in 2008, we can do, literally 20, 50, maybe 100 times faster than we did back then. And no, and the reason we do so many different methods is that no one method gives all the answers. So for instance, magnetic sees iron and steel, electromagnetic sees non-ferromagnetic metal, radar will see trenches and wood and non-metallic features. So you need this complement of different physical properties of different pieces of the puzzle to put together. And to give an analogy, analogy that I think everyone can understand, especially since we're all inundated with medical analogies these days, is who would even dream of going to surgery for major operation without some type of non-intrusive investigation? You would never let a surgeon operate on you without an x-ray. And how uncommon is it that you go in and they give you an x-ray and they don't see what they're looking for? So they give you an MRI, they take you an ultrasound, you take a tracer that you swallow. So it's very analogous. The surgical team, you have an array of non-intrusive, non-destructive techniques before the surgeon excavates, and similarly archaeological team they should look at the airfoils and satellite imagery and this array of different geophysical instruments, put together a picture before they ever even think about beginning an excavation.
That's incredible. So finally, Dan Stone has a question, and I'm going to add to it. We've heard so much about ground penetrating radar, of course, in Canada, with the very sad discovery of the graves of the Indigenous children from the Indian residential schools. So Dan is asking if you would say a little more about ground penetrating radar. What depths does it reach? What kind of image do you pick up? And how the nature of the ground affects what you find. And I'm going to add one last question to that before we end tonight. Has the fact that ground penetrating radar has been so much in the news in Canada, has that affected the knowledge of people about the work you're doing? And in fact, you're a Canadian, has the Canadian government expressed any interest in the work that you are doing?
Yeah, that's also a big question. A lot of pieces there. And the first thing I'm going to do though is and I don't want to sound like a know-it-all, but I be flippant, but I'm going to rephrase a bit of that question, because it's directly applicable to the Holocaust, the discovery of these First Nations burials. And it's not the discovery of these First Nations burials. Similar to, we didn't discover these mass graves. And even more so with the First Nations burials, because there's still people alive, survivors, eyewitnesses, people that actually were involved in First Nations people that were involved in burying these people. And I haven't been involved in any of these, although I have been mapping First Nations burials for more than 30 years, but I haven't been involved in any of these residential schools. But what they've done is provide pinpoint locations and I guess you might say scientific confirmation of these burials. But they're always known to be there. And similarly, it would be, for instance, for, as I'm sure there's many Jewish people out there, I think we would all be appalled if someone said, wow, astoundingly, look, we discovered mass graves at a supposed extermination camp, when of course none of us doubt what happened and the existence of Sobibor or Treblinka or Belzec or Bergen-Belsen or any of these places. And so yeah, very, I think that's an important point that we certainly should bring to Holocaust studies, and we should certainly bring to looking at these First Nation sites. Okay, then radar. I mean, yes, it's been astounding to see. Well, something that really astounded me actually was that in all the news reports I saw in May and June and July, they never talked about geophysicists. They always talked about radar specialists. And radar, I think they talked about ground penetrating radar technicians. The ground penetrating radar is just one of many, many techniques. It does work particularly well in sandy environments, such as in the Baltics and much of Poland. And it also works well at a lot of these residential school burials and a lot of native burials. And I can tell you one reason why we use it a lot of prehistoric burials is because even though dense clays are a lot more common than sandy environments, especially in the Prairie province, it's so much easier to dig in sand. That's one reason why there's so many burials there. But radar is just one of many techniques, and it will have its limits. And there's certainly going to be cases where people will go out and do radar surveys, and it just simply won't work. The publicity, literally tens of millions of dollars now that are being thrown at this by governments, mostly by governments, provincial and federal government, has certainly created a bit of a feeding frenzy of let's call them radar technicians chasing this kind of work, because there are many radar technicians in Canada. Why? Because radar is the only technique that can see non-metal material such as bone, but also PVC or wood or plastic. So there's hundreds of companies that use radar instrumentation for mapping plastic utility, and now they're suddenly jumping into the residential school burial mapping. There's a lot I could say about the technical stuff, and I'll probably avoid that. But again, coming back to Holocaust studies and what I was talking about here, the archaeology of the Holocaust. Again, we knew these burials were here. What I think is happening, and what is not a good thing, is to turn this into a treasure hunt by a lot of essentially white Canadian geophysical technicians. What's important here is not so much, in my opinion, is not so much to just simply find the burials, but to unravel the story. What happened? When did it happen? How did this happen? What's the history behind this? Who is buried here? And so the radar really is just one part of a long storytelling process. We have to get archives. I mean, we still have people alive that carried out this work. We have the perpetrators, we have the victims, we have First Nations people that carried out the burials. So we need interviews. There's chemical techniques we can use. There's all kinds of historical records, not all of which have been retrieved. We have 4 different churches involved. We have many of the perpetrators still alive. So yeah, I find it, I mean, if it wasn't so tragic, I would say it's actually somewhat amusing how Canadian media, I think partly driven by the media, has been so fixated on the radar, which is really just a small part of this processing of unraveling what's going on. And given the tens of millions of dollars that are being thrown at this, absolutely this work should be done by First Nations people, First Nations and Métis people. The money's there, the equipment can be bought, the training can be completed where it doesn't exist. So that's my sort of big picture. No one from the government has contacted me. I'm certainly happy to provide any advice or as is my company, to provide any service we can. I can tell you, I have been contacted by one of the 4 churches, not the Catholic Church. They're waiting for grants, and if they request, I will be involved. Also, I'll just mention this because it's really interesting. We all know that I think there's 130, I forget the exact number, 139 so residential schools, but there are also many day schools. And I've also been contacted by 2 First Nations in northern Alberta, that they have reason to suspect that there's First Nations, there's children's burials on the sites of these day school sites. So yeah, I think we're just beginning to understand the scope and scale of this problem.
And I think one of the most important things to come out of this is Canadians are finally reckoning with their history, because certainly when I went to school right here in Winnipeg, this was not the narrative of our history that was taught at all. And I think many people, it has been a shock for many people because they knew nothing about it. And you know, certainly the Indigenous people did, as you say, but not your average Canadian. So it is such important work. I was going to end here, but I see that we have one more question from a survivor who named Linda Sudak, who is from, and please forgive me if I mispronounce the name, Podhaice, Podhaice in Poland. And her father and relatives were killed in a mass grave outside in the forest, outside that place. And she is interested in having the grave in the forest located. Do you know anything about this?
I don't, but two things. I don't know anything about that specific site. You know, I can tell you that in Lithuania alone, which is a tiny country, had far less Jews than Poland. There's more than 204. Well, yeah, now there's more than 204 document, and I say 204 because there's a Holocaust atlas for Lithuania that lists 204 mass grave sites, but more have been found. Latvia has hundreds, and Poland will have many hundreds. So I'll say two very practical things. Since we did our work in 2008, Rabbi Michael Shudrick, the head rabbi of Poland, I know they have a ground penetrating radar system. They have trained people. They have been systematically investigating Jewish graves in Poland. I did a few surveys with Rabbi Shudrick while I was there in 2008. Another practical thing I'll say, and I don't know where this village is, but the archaeologists in Holocaust Escape Tunnel, there were several archaeologists, but Dr. Richard Freund with the hat and the sunglasses. I've been working with him since 2000 at literally about 50 different sites, and I've been working with him in 2008 at Holocaust sites. And he's open to he's pretty much open to anything. He's at Christopher Newport University, and he certainly has plans to go back to Poland and Lithuania and Latvia next summer. And depending upon what information is available and what his plans are, he'd certainly consider any site. But yeah, in particular, I would contact Rabbi Shudrick, who is methodically addressing one Holocaust mass grave after another now.
That's wonderful. Well, I want to thank you. There's been a lot of people writing to me as we've been talking about how important this program was and how astounded they've been by the information that you've given to us. And I just want to thank you again so much. And remind everyone who has attended tonight that we will be putting this up on YouTube. I'm sure that you'll be reaching out to a lot of people to share it with. So thank you everyone who attended. Thank you, Greg, for the technical support. Thank you, Jason. And thank you, Paul. And good night.
Thank you, Belle, for organizing this. And thank you everyone for staying around to the end.